Okay, so hello, Wade. Hello, everybody. And I'm just going to, no, but Wade does not need an introduction to our group. He doesn't need an introduction to anybody in the astrological community. He's basically everywhere. So it's hard not to have know about him. And it's very difficult for me to introduce him as well because it's a bit like introducing my own brother in a way. I'm so close to Wade, and we intertwine on so many projects. So a little bit about him. He's based in Brooklyn, New York. He's been a bit of a traveler. He's been all over the place, but uh, in New York again at the moment. He's very active in the STA school. He is one of the main leading tutors with me for the horary, but he's also written the Astronomy for Astrologers course and a new mundane astrology course, which am I right, Wade? It's in a pilot
Yeah, we
presentation.
just wrapped up the pilot delivery. I'm in the final stages of grading a few last submissions. That's how recent it is. So,
Yeah, so the pilot delivery is like the first delivery of it. There might be some tweaks or whatever before he goes more public with it. But he's very involved in mundane astrology generally, and he is also the editor of the mundane section on the Skyscript website, the Inmundo, which is how do you record? Oh, the Mundo publishing desk, you call it. And he hosts every now and again the World Astrology Summit, a conference dedicated to mundane astrology and global issues. So he's got a lot going on, but he's a real astrologer. He consults and he's got clients. He's a busy man. So I'm always glad to get him on the program here. And tonight he's going to be looking at this issue of Fortuna, part of Fortune, which is a tricky issue. It's not something that you like. I've had this issue wrapped around me for decades, Wade, and decided I'm not getting involved in that one.
it's very funny because I got alerted to all of this. Part of the master's course program, part of my training with the STA involved an assignment about either writing about Lily's life or writing about the history of the part of fortune. I did Lily's life.
I
That's
sent you that. I don't remember.
Yes, and I the assignment I did that I turned in was about Lily's life, and that's what led to the autobiography. But I actually did both. I just didn't send the other thing in, so this has been kind of on my radar because of you.
Oh, that's
Yeah.
interesting. So
Yeah.
what's made you decide to, like what is the research that you've done? I mean, like you're going to start any minute, but just give us have you presented this research before anyway?
Yeah,
Or I'm
so
so interested. I want to watch it. I've not seen this, so
I'll tell you what happened when I was doing the master's course and writing about the history of the part of fortune. The reason that this kind of became a sticking point for me was because of the relationship that this part of fortune had to length of life techniques, which was a broader thing that I was beginning to kind of wrap my head around. So I developed that over a couple of years, wrote basically a paper on the topic, and then I presented it for the first time. I think it was at Norwalk in 2022. But just last year, I was invited to the Sophia Center and delivered that at the University of Trinity St. David. So that was an exciting opportunity to kind of share this. But what I didn't get in the process of this was, a good recording of the ideas and getting them kind of on record in a way that's easier for the public to grab. So I'm excited to be able to share this here with, your Skyscript group. And
yeah. So, and I think that there may be, just so people know, that there'll be any editing, nobody's faces will be shown, but it's possible that we might use this on the Skyscript more public site. So, if you do a good job first, wait.
all right, perfect. Well, shall I share my screen?
Yeah, go ahead. Let's get started. I'm so
Okay,
excited.
great. And then I will, let me just get the camera looking correct. Okay. Perfect. So I'm calling this presentation Finding Fortuna, a technical mirroring of the mind. And I've got this Latin tag underneath, ne supra crepidam. This was from the account of Pliny the Elder. He talked about a painter named Apelles, and a cobbler came up and corrected him on the detail of a shoe. And So the painter Apelles fixed that detail on the shoe, and then the cobbler came by the next day and said, well, actually, you've got an issue here with the calf, you've got an issue here with the knee. And the artist responded, don't go beyond your area of expertise. He basically said, nothing beyond the shoe. That's the literal translation. Nothing beyond the shoe. Your area of expertise is there. So I put this here to say, I am not a Latin translator. I am not a Greek translator. There is a limit to my own understanding. And so I just want to start by saying that there is a shoe involved here. But there's some material that's come down to us in English translation related to the part of fortune that's been a particular interest to me over the past couple of years. Just a couple select passages that I kind of want to bring together in one place to hopefully maybe reconstruct a timeline about, it's definitely like a loose timeline, but an idea of what might have happened in the process of origination to today. So at some point, well into the past, beyond access of public or available record, we get the emergence of fortune, or what was called also the lot of the moon. That language, lot of the moon, is going to be a pretty important one to keep in mind because of where this discussion is going to go. So somewhere into the distant past, fortune emerges, and then the three main Hellenistic texts that we see reference them have different approaches to what we do with fortune. The most obvious place where we see a breaking away of tradition is in how we calculate the location of the lot. Ptolemy follows a tradition that does not reverse. He, in his language, seems to acknowledge that some do reverse. You can see here, he says, take as the lot of fortune always the amount of the number of degrees, both by night and by day. That additional inclusion of both by night and by day seems to suggest this is something that was in a footnote somewhere that Deborah wrote. So I'm just importing this idea directly from there. That he's insistent on this point by putting night before day makes the argument that he wasn't just unaware of this other technique. He's saying that's the wrong approach. This is the way that we ought to do it, as is commonly found in texts of this period. Okay, Dorotheus and Valens, however, that are writing on either side of Ptolemy, they change the calculation so that there's a separate calculation by day and then an inverted calculation by night. Let's read the full passage here from Ptolemy to get an understanding about why his position is that the part of fortune should not be reversed. He says the lot of fortune is always the amount of the number of degrees by day, by night, and by day, which is the distance from the sun to the moon, and which extends to an equal distance from the ascendant in the order of the following signs, in order that whatever relation and aspect the sun bears to the ascendant, the moon will also bear to the lot of fortune, that it may be, as it were, a lunar horoscope. So what is he talking about here? I've got a visual demonstration, 16 degrees of Scorpio rising. We have a building waxing trine between the sun and the moon. So we take first the moon's phase, the distance the moon has from the sun in the order of the signs. In this example, we're 9 degrees short of an even trine, which is 120 degrees. We've got 111. And you would then cast 111 degrees from the ascendant, and there you have the part of fortune. That other part that he mentioned, which is that the ascendant and the sun will have the same relationship that the part of fortune and the moon have, which is to say that if the sun has risen over the ascendant by 35 degrees, then visually, just taking a look at this, the moon will have risen over the part of fortune by the same distance. So that there's a lunar ascendant, which is fortune itself, and then there is a solar ascendant, which is the visible horizon. So how this caught my attention, this relationship to the sun and the ascendant and the moon and lot of fortune, I slowed down a little bit processing that information when I was, you coming into this, there's so many different options. Do I reverse? Do I not reverse? And I remember when that question was first put to me, which I just said I wasn't even aware that there were two different options. I remember the feeling like, you know, somebody had just completely blinded me. Deer in headlights kind of look. I don't even know what to think about that. I don't know the implications. I don't know, what it would mean. I remember favoring the reversal formula though, because I think without the reversal, my part of fortune is in like a partile opposition with Mars and in the eighth house. And if it's not reversed, I think it's in a partile conjunction with Jupiter, or if it is reversed. So I wanted the conjunction to Jupiter more than the opposition to Mars, but um, I had to agree that I can't just base what I do on what makes my chart feel better and a little bit more exciting. But this is where the conversation kind of started to open up for me. I don't know if you have read Deborah's notes on Dorotheus 3. They're available. You can find it in the articles link on SkyScript. I put the web address there. It's a great text that talks about the length of life techniques as they're brought to us principally in Dorotheus, but we've also, for reference, in the work of Ptolemy, and then there's some mention of other astrologers. And in this particular diagram that Deborah built, Al-Kabisi is mentioned. But for our purposes, Al-Kabisi comes much later in the tradition, and he would only be reflecting the knowledge that would be coming to him from these channels. So I kind of want to focus on what Dorotheus and what Ptolemy have to say about determination of the high leg. So when we're looking at this length of life technique, there are steps that you take to figure out what are the pairs of the planet that we're looking for, and perhaps its dispositor as well. This is a whole subject in length of life calculation about finding which planet is giving life to the individual and how much life does it give? Does it give 50 years, 60 years, 70 years? At what time does that light get cut off effectively? So it's a bit, heavy and dark, and but it's a big part of the historical astrological record. I find this my favorite thing to study. I remember years ago having a conversation with another astrologer making the point that I think nestled in this topic, it's like a culmination of everything, every natal technique, every, kind of underpinning understanding that we have of timing and directions and progressions and dispositorship and the giving and taking of life. All these things kind of culminate into this one place. So it's a very interesting place to kind of dig in. These notes on Dorotheus were very helpful in the early days of me getting a quick uptake on what the languages that I was running into in a lot of these texts. This is focusing on Dorotheus, but there's going to be a lot drawing from the Persian and Arabic texts as well. So in the first place, we're only paying attention to Dorotheus and Ptolemy, and you'll see that obviously in a diurnal chart, our first place we want to go is that the ascendant would be leading the discussion about length of life, or sorry, the sun would be leading the discussion about length of life for both Ptolemy and Dorotheus in a day chart. But there are conditions that need to be met, and if they're not met, then you move on throughout the list. It's when we get to items 3, 4, and 5 where things get a little bit unique between Dorotheus and Ptolemy in a way that's worth talking about. So Dorotheus abandons at this stage any diurnal or nocturnal distinction. If you don't satisfy conditions 1 or 2 and you're already working your way towards 3, 4, and 5, whether you're a diurnal or nocturnal chart, the next place to look is the ascendant as step 3. If that is not going to work for the reasons I identified here, you would move on to the lot of fortune. And if that does not work, you would use the degree of the preceding syzygy. Okay. Now, Ptolemy has a completely different appreciation for what we're doing here. There's a separation between the diurnal and nocturnal charts. In a diurnal chart, the third step, if it's not going to be the sun and it's not going to be the moon, then in the next step, we're going to be looking at the planet with the most dominance over the sun, the ascendant, and the new moon. So this is of interest to me because what I'm noticing here is that Ptolemy is combining that same principle that we were just talking about with respect to the part of fortune. In this diagram here, that the sun has relation to the ascendant that the moon has to the part of fortune. So you can see planet with most dominance over the sun and the ascendant, which are a pair with each other. This is the sun's dawning place, is the ascendant. And all of the houses are really reckoned as, the passage of solar time and the passage of the sun in a 24-hour period. The angles are entirely associated with the sun as like a core foundational principle. But we would also consider the degree of the preceding new moon. Now, why is that? If you think about a lunation like a new moon, a syzygy like a new moon, the moon is dark. So the dominant luminary in this circumstance is the sun. So all of these conditions on the diurnal side are related to the solar concept of life. And on the nocturnal side, we get the mirror of this, the planet then with the most dominance over the degree of the moon, and the moon's ascendant, which is the lot of fortune, sometimes called the lot of the moon, and the preceding full moon. And the reason for this is because in a full moon, the moon is the dominant luminary. Okay. If those don't work for the reasons identified, Ptolemy says in a day chart, move to the ascendant. The ascendant is where you will land. And in a nocturnal chart, what we need to determine is if this person was born after a new moon or a full moon. If they're entering a season just after a new moon, where the dominant luminary is the sun, we revert back to the ascendant. If it's during a full moon, then we go to the moon's ascendant, which is the lot of fortune. And if the lot of fortune is in bad circumstance or bad placement, we end on the ascendant. So part of the reason that I got into this topic so strongly was trying to understand all of these conditions in Ptolemy about why this order, why wouldn't it have swapped the other way around? Why would we, for instance, prioritize this over this? And I think understanding that in Ptolemy's appreciation for it, that there is no reversal of the ascendant, of the calculation of the part of fortune, because it's a lunar ascendant. It's meant to mirror the same phase that the moon has from the sun, and then cast that against the ascendant to find the moon's own dawning place. Okay, so this is what Ptolemy is writing about, saying that the moon has that relationship to fortune like it's a lunar horoscope. Elsewhere in the Tetrabiblos, in Book 3, he says, we will sketch each of these subjects briefly, explaining, as we said before, together with the effective powers by themselves, the actual procedure of investigation. And as for the nonsense on which many waste their labor, and of which not even a plausible account can be given, this we shall dismiss in favor of the primary natural causes. What, however, admits of prediction we shall investigate, not by means of lots and numbers of which no reasonable explanation can be given, but merely through the science of the aspects of the stars, to the places with which they have familiarity. In general terms, blah, blah, blah. But the point that he's making here is why if we're reversing the lot of fortune and we have additional lots, for instance, what is the justification for doing this? Why is this being done? Where do these come from? And if you can't provide a reasonable explanation that's better than the one that we already have, then let's just stick here. So this is the argument that Ptolemy's putting down. We can start to see that he's outlining controversies that are related to reversals, but also lots, the multiplicity of lots, there being numerous lots, and some elements with which number is brought into this, and what lots and numbers might mean. I have some thoughts on, but we'll see if we get to it. Lest anyone think that Ptolemy was writing this idea, Dorotheus is writing before him, Valens after, that he's representing, perhaps a new idea or a new innovation or trying something. It's worth pointing out chart 81, which we get in Greek horoscopes. So this is available. You've got the citation here. I need to give special thanks to both Dorian Greenbaum and Deb Holding on this. Dorian, she allowed me to take a look at her chapters on fortune. and that was very helpful to be able to understand what research has already gone into it from her perspective. And it was because of Deb I found out about this chart in the first place. But this is a nocturnal chart. The ascendant has 18 degrees of Scorpio rising. The sun is at 14 degrees of Aries. Okay. 18 degrees Scorpio, 14 degrees Aries. The sun is below the horizon. And so what the author says that the lot of fortune counting inversely will be in the sign of Jupiter and in its triangle. So this is where we're talking about the triplicity of Jupiter. We'll see what that means in a minute. This lot, some will ignorantly assign to Libra. So the horoscope that we have has the part of fortune listed as being at 17 degrees of Sagittarius, which is what we would consider the daytime, always day calculation. I think the devil's in the details here, that this individual says that it would be, only the ignorant who would have reversed the calculation to find the part of fortune in Libra. But he makes his point about if we're counting inversely, what does he mean by that? We're going to come back to it. It's a lot less complicated than it sounds. We're going to talk about that when we get to a quote in Valens that brings up the exact same idea, this idea of counting backwards, and how that relates not to changing the calculation, but just making the calculation easier, if you don't have, if you just need shortcuts and quick association. Okay, now this is, going to bring us all the way back to the work of Manilius, who's writing around 10 AD. Manilius is an important source for us to consider because Ptolemy's saying, listen, we don't reverse the part of fortune, and it's calculated in one manner only. And, we don't need to have an endless series of lots. So the question then is, okay, what were the other ideas that were happening around, or that, Ptolemy would have been drawing from, or that were around in this time that might have influenced these comments, or perhaps have some relationship to why Ptolemy does or doesn't reverse, or why, for instance, Dorotheus and Valens have an extended series of lots that Ptolemy does not have. So that's what I want to get into. And to do that, we're going to need to take a little bit of a detour to the circle of Athla. Athla meaning labors. It's the same word that's used when we're talking about the 12 labors of Hercules. Same word. So I just want to quickly bring your attention to a resource that is available. I find Manilius to be an endless source of really, really valuable and meaningful discussion on astrological topics. There are many places where, yeah, I don't exactly do what he's describing, and that system might be a little too complicated for me, this, that, the other. But there is a real beauty in the poem that Manilius writes. And there are some concepts that really didn't land for me until reading Manilius. So I think it's a great resource. It just so happens that the SkyScript members group have been going through Manilius book by book. There are 5 books to Manilius so far. Books 1 and 2 have been brought into this really lovely, if you're a SkyScript member, you'll have access to this in the extras member of the members area in SkyScript. So book 1 was brought into English by Edward Sherborne in 1665, and then book 2, using a different source, Heathcote Garrod in 1911. So my understanding is that all 5 books are eventually going to be compiled with annotations and illustrations in each 5 book from a different source, so we get shades of Manilius. It's a great resource, and I know that they're on a temporary break, so plenty of time for you to get caught up with where the group is at if you're interested. It's this passage, which we're not going to read the whole thing. We're going to read parts of it. It's this passage that interests us with respect to the part of fortune and what Manilius has to say about it. I should tell you right now, Manilius does unequivocally, very clearly outline a process where the part of fortune calculation is reversed. So already by Manilius's time, The idea that maybe we're supposed to reverse for nocturnal charts is, I would say, probably pretty widely proliferated. It shows up in the work of Dorotheus, it shows up in the work of Valens, and then it's rebuffed as a process in Ptolemy's work. But let's read the rest of what Manilius has to say about the lots, because he's got a completely different understanding about how lot systems work, which is very useful for us because in between the lines we can start to see what some of the earlier assumptions about what this lot was and what it did. They're visible here. Okay. First, we're going to focus on this passage here. By fixed laws, nature, he's talking about nature, united separate limbs into a single body. Now, coming into this, we're talking about how nature constructed the universe with the earth at its center, and there are just all of these celestial structures that surround us. And what he's about to do is walk into a description of the zodiacal circle. And so he's saying that there are fixed laws that govern this circle, that there are so many degrees from different points in this particular circle, so that the 0 point of Aries is the same distance from 0 point of Cancer as it always and forever will be. It's a fixed skeleton. He said, by fixed law, she united separate limbs into a single body. So when I read that, I think we're talking about the leg of a bull is right next to the arm of a twin, which is next to the claw of a crab, which is next to the paw of a lion, which is next to the foot of a virgin. You know, all of these limbs, they all touch each other in some kind of way, and they are discrete, and yet they represent a single body, ordaining that air and earth and fire and flowing water should each for the other provide mutual sustenance in order that harmony might prevail over so many elements at variance and the universe stand firm in the bonds of a reciprocal federation. Now, that term reciprocal federation comes up in a couple of places in Manilius's text, and he uses it when he's talking about the triplicities. So, for instance, Cancer and Scorpio and Pisces would all be in a reciprocal federation with each other. They share a very strong, unbreakable reciprocal kinship that is fixed and exists until the end of time. And the way that he describes this, I mean, he talks about how the three of them get along. So, I loved reading what he said about the fire signs, where he made a comment about Aries being very good-natured, but the centaur and the lion, they pick on the poor ram because he's smaller and, but he doesn't hold any grudge in his heart. It's just a very interesting way that, there's a vignette about the way in which Manilius sees these signs interact with each other. But that's when he says reciprocal federation, he's talking about triplicities. And then he says that the infinite variety of circumstances that might occur in human affairs, all of the possible sufferings, the callings, and the skills, and all the vicissitudes imaginable. That vicissitude just means an unfortunate circumstance. Um, these nature included in the allotment. She arranged them in as many portions as she had created signs and made a fixed dispensation, each portion having its special benefice. And by an unchanging system, she so disposed the full reckonings of man's estate among the stars that any portion would always stand next to the same portion in adjacent signs. Let me interpret that for you for just a moment. What he's saying is any circumstance or any kind of calling or skill or talent or any ill luck or good luck, anything that you can think of, these have been given to one of 12 lots. There's as many as there are signs, and they are evenly dispersed across the signs, and it's an unchanging system so that every single person has these two lots next to each other, 30 degrees apart in this particular order. So for instance, you might have, let's think about two different lots. You could have, your lot of fortune. Let's talk about your natal lot of fortune. And then there's a calculation for a lot of brothers. So for some people, maybe the lot of fortune is exactly on the 10th house cusp. And the lot of brothers could be in the 9th or the 8th or the 7th. And for other people, it could be in the 10th or the 11th or 12th. It could be anywhere. That's not what Manilius is describing. What Manilius is describing is a situation where there is an anchor point where the allotment begins, and then there is an even 30-degree distribution of these lots that is degree by degree. And there's a contrast drawn between these and houses. Rob Hand, in one of his works, I'm so sorry, I don't remember which one it is now. He had made a comment about these being Fortuna houses or houses from fortune. I understand the temptation. You'll see it too. It's very easy to understand why you'd want to collapse these onto one thing. But actually, what's kind of being described here is a situation where you've got 12 houses, which are the 12 temples, and there's going to be the sky divided between them. But inside some of these temples, some lots are going to be drawn. And the lots are being drawn in 30-degree segments from each other throughout the zodiac. There's a distinction between houses and signs that I think starts to show up a little bit here and becomes clear, and I hope in just a few slides. He says, now just as these aspects of human affairs, wherein the whole sum of fortune will be found committed, are when placed in the zodiac favored or frowned on by the seven planets in their courses. So he's saying these 12 lots, they will be transited. There will be times where Saturn will come over and conjoin one of these lots, or it will trine one of these lots. Jupiter will cast a trine to one of these lots. And then that should bring a boon or helpfulness to that area of life. So, either it's going to be frowned or favored upon, as he says here. So just as there are transits to these lots, and just as the divine force rotates the skies through the cardinal points so that an influence, whether it's good or malign, comes over each allotment. So he's making this kind of point of what ends up happening is with primary motion, there is this spinning of the celestial sphere that creates systems of houses. And even likewise, you must expect the issue of such and such a business. So he's just saying, there are these transits, create a change of circumstance with respect to these lots. They're not permanent or fixed. They respond to transits. And he says it's the same that you would expect that the houses give certain powers, and take certain powers away, whether they are stronger or weaker, through angularity or cadency. So if you pick up the red, I don't have it on me, it's over there, but the red gold translation, the Loeb translation of the Astronomica, in the introduction, the circle of Athla is discussed, and these are the meanings of each of the 12 lots. So the first lot is called fortune. It's fortune, and it signifies one's home, one's household, one's property. And then the lot that is found 30 degrees away corresponds to warfare, foreign, and travel. The third lot is civil life and business relationships. The fourth is law, both litigation and oratory. The fifth is marriage, friendships. The sixth, means and prosperity. The seventh is danger. The eighth is class, the ninth is children, 10th way of life, 11th health, and he writes and sickness, which I put in parentheses. But then 12, he writes success in attaining aims. So when I first saw this list, let me get my annotations down. I wondered if this was just another rendering of the houses. It was the very first place that my brain went because I saw health being associated with the 11th. And I thought, you know what? I can see that happening, that health in the 11th could be related to each other. And I also know in Manilius's time that Saturn was in its joy in the fourth house, and Saturn's associated with law and litigation. So maybe that, but I couldn't make sense, of why the 12th house would be success in attaining aims. I suppose maybe way of life or character for the like a 10th house theme makes sense. Seventh house dangers makes sense. Means and prosperity. So then I started thinking, I wonder if this is kind of that sixth house of labor and toil, that kind of connection. And friendships and marriage, maybe. But the problem is that things really start to kind of fall apart and a few of these places that don't seem to hold the same symbolism. It's like there are some false positives here, is I think what I came to. So I had to make an association or decide for myself to let it go, any expectation that this is a reassemblage of the 12 houses deriving from its logic in any way. Um, but I did notice something that kind of threw a question mark out at me. I had thought, well, Saturn, I feel Saturn has to have some association with the fourth. That feels really clear to me. That feels really clear to me. And I also would make some assumption, I think, in law and civil life being next to each other, I started to think this looks like a pattern I recognize. This looks like something I've seen before in Manilius's work, where he talks about Virgo being associated with civil life. And he doesn't talk about business relationships, actually. Gold's way of reinterpreting this as business relationships is missing, I think, the point of what Manilius was trying to say. He was talking about the ingenuity of individuals who create solutions that didn't exist before, sometimes using made-up languages. So he talks about stenographers, for instance, and things like that. Litigation and oratory, that's, so then I started thinking, well, what if what's happening here is something like this? This is associated with Libra. This becomes associated with Virgo. Leo becomes associated with warfare and foreign travel. I don't necessarily, I'm going to have to just circle the parts that don't make sense to me. I'm starting to think I don't get why foreign travel and Leo would be associated, but I do think I understand that law, litigation, oratory, Libra, Saturn exalted there, that makes sense. Virgo, civil life and civil administration, that makes sense. Leo, I've got a little bit of a question mark around the warfare element that makes sense to me. Back in Manilius's time, there was a lot of conversation about not about how Leos love the stage, but about how lions are terrifying, war-hungry, bloodthirsty, violent creatures, and that they love and delight in themes of warfare. So it's a different association. So that kind of, I'm halfway on that one. Cancer, home, household property. Well, that seemed to me to make a good deal of sense. Not just from a, um, you know, how do I want to explain this? It's not because cancer signifies the home necessarily, but it's more about an understanding that cancer is often used as a natural starting point in ancient astrological works. And sometimes it's not outright named, but cancer being in the first position is about as natural in the old text as Aries being in first position. The reason being that the ancient Egyptian calendars started with Cancer, or the flooding of the Nile, is the beginning of the year. It eventually came back to Aries for, I think, good reason, because it's the beginning of the year is about the ascendancy principle, and when the sun enters Cancer, it's at its maximum declination. It makes more sense to start, when is the sun starting to gain in declination against the equator? That's 0 Aries. So that makes a good deal of sense to me. Now I need to kind of make sense of the rest here. I don't know why, if this is Libra, why should Scorpio um, be marriage and friendships? That does not feel right. In fact, I remember thinking this is the big hole in this ship and it's going to cause it to sink. This is the thing I can't make sense of. Um, Means and prosperity. Okay, I actually do think I can understand that. Again, what Manilius says about Sagittarius is that that sign is about the way in which the human and the animal worlds meet in the middle. And he focuses a lot on training animals, but there's this whole subtext about the subjugation of the natural environment and survival of human civilization in wild contexts. So that maybe I can see a bit of a link. Certainly makes sense to me that Capricorn and the seventh house, those would be kind of related. First of all, Capricorn is opposing the first seven, having like a, safe versus danger principle. Yeah, that feels clear and not contentious at all. But also Capricorn, because Libra and Saturn, this exaltation image I had already felt must be coming through. I felt comfortable thinking, well, Mars is a very appropriate planet to represent a word like danger, and something like this. The eighth class, social rank, and repute. That's going to be Aquarius. That's a very consistent theme that we read in Aquarius. It's a social sign, it's a human sign. It's the sign of Saturn. And as a result, even if it was before, if we're taking not sign rulerships and take sign rulerships out of it, take Saturn out of it. Aquarius is the image of the human taking water from the stream, and bringing it back to civilization from the river. Ariadne, I think, is Eridanus. So this is, I think, something a very strong social symbol. Anyway, then after Aquarius, we get Pisces, children. It's the exaltation of Venus. Yeah, makes complete sense. Then Aries, exaltation of the sun, makes sense. Now Taurus, exaltation of the moon. When Manilius talks about the moon, and when he talks about Taurus, and when he talks about this law, he talks about the dispensing of medicine and life-giving medicine. I think that what happened is Gold made the same mistake that modern astrologers make when they hear the word health. They also think in that subject must mean the topic illness, which is, I think, not quite what's intended. I think there is a house of health, and there are things that then happen and subjugate and undermine health. And then that brings us back to Gemini, success in attaining aims. So all of these, this is where I started to, kind of organize these ideas. Um, with the expectation that I think just as the sun has the natural starting point at the ascendant, that this is building on a tradition where another natural starting point, the zodiacal natural starting point, because what's happening with the houses is a solar point of reference that's happening with local sky, concerned with primary motion. This lot-based system is sign-based from what I can tell, and the way that this is appearing to deliver. So why wouldn't it start from the beginning of the zodiac, just like the sun's houses start from the beginning, of the primary circle, the celestial sphere? So if I reorganize this just to bring these principles together, the places where I had questions, I no longer have questions anymore. When you see them together like this, I think that they all make sense. So I'm going to walk you through my justification. Lots 1, 5, and 9, that they are associated with the watery triplicity, these signs. This is also, I believe, stemming from a tradition that predates the sign rulers, where Mars would have ruled Scorpio. I think instead it's drawing principally upon the image and the exaltation ruler, or the planet which finds its exaltation in that sign. So now suddenly all of the water signs make a whole lot of sense for all of this: home, household, property, marriage, friendship, children. This is a reciprocal federation. This is us. Who, we're connected to. This is our progeny, our extended family tree. This is what brings us close to. The fire signs then have, classically fiery solar kind of principle about them, not Jupiterian, not Venusian, not about proliferation and fecundity and things of this way. Instead, now we're talking about, warfare and foreign travel. Again, this foreign travel element, I now think about the relationship that, first of all, anybody who's writing about a lion in the Western material is almost certainly not anywhere near one. So the whole principle of a lion already invokes this idea of needing to go to a completely different continent to interact with that particular beast. But you hear stories about lions, in some cases you might have even seen one traveling through your town at some stage. But this idea of warfare and foreign travel, having done a little bit more research because of the question I had, I came to some reasonable comfort with that. Same with means and prosperity. The connection with Sagittarius, and then the connection here, the solar principle of way of life, the nature of one's character. Yeah, this all totally fits with what Manilius had to say, both about these signs and these planets elsewhere in his text. Then we take a look at the earth signs. which seem quite pragmatic places to be paying attention. So when he talks about, when Manilius talks about Virgo, he talks about this being a sign of city administrators, civil administrators, because the gift of Mercury is the ability to organize and the ability to invent and the ability to manage the affairs and administer. And I think he's also developing a little bit on the symbolism related to, the angelic image of the Virgin, that's been captured here, the woman with wings, that angelic image, because angels are often painted as those who are, divine operatives on earth to arrange the affairs of the natural world to be in accordance with divine will. So there just seems to be something about organizing and administering that comes with this particular. So the third lot, the third sign from Cancer being Virgo, that makes sense to me. Capricorn, the exaltation of Mars, danger. Yep, makes sense. I edit gold away from health and sickness to health and medicine and the administration of medicine, sorry, administering of medicine. This brings us to the 11th lot, which would be, kind of aligned with Taurus, which is the exaltation of the moon. And then finally, we are brought to the air signs, which all have very clear associations with human principles of life. You could say that this is also something that's very human, and I understand that, but this is a human image. This is considered one of the human signs. These four are the humane signs, and these are where we can see a distinction in human behavior. We have in the air signs Saturn's exaltation corresponding with the fourth lot, so law, litigation, oratory, Aquarius and Gemini both being associated with other themes of human attainment, so success, social rank, repute, these kinds of ideas. So if we go back just to that quote that came from Manilius and just break this down one more time, we're not dealing with houses, we're dealing with individual lots. What he says is by fixed laws, she united separate limbs into a single body, ordaining that air and earth and fire and flowing water, which are in a reciprocal federation, they exist in triplicity relationship, should provide mutual sustenance in order that harmony might prevail. So this is, I think, probably the earliest example of an that I can think of an astrologer associating the signs with the four elements. That the zodiacal circle is composed of four different triplicities: the air, the earth, the fire, and the water. It's not said outright, and so I think it's been missed and easily looked over. But if you spend a little bit of time with it, as I have, it feels like a natural reading of that. Finally, he's in this passage, he says, nature arranged them in as many portions as she had created signs, making a fixed dispensation, each portion having its special benefice. And by an unchanging system, she so disposed the full reckonings of man's estate among the stars, that any portion would always stand next to the same portion in adjacent signs. So as long as you know where your part of fortune is, 30 degrees in the order of the signs is where you find that second part, the part of warfare and foreign travel, whether these would be beneficial or harmful to you. Civil life and business relationships is going to be 60 degrees on, 90 degrees. Everybody would have this exact same structure in the same way that my first house is just caught between my 12th and my second, just like yours are, because these are skeletal frameworks that Manilius is representing here in this tradition that predates him, that gives us a little bit of a window into alternate lot approaches that were being taken in this time. And so what we start to see is that there's a real influence here with respect to Manilius's approach that recognizes these triplicities, these reciprocal federations, and acknowledges this zodiacal circle as being an extension of the lunar ascendant, just like the 12 houses are the extension of the visible ascendant. Okay, because the houses are the solar frame of reference. They allow us to measure the east to west effects of primary motion. So the sun rises, it culminates, it sets, and this creates for us the principle of angularity. It sets a very clear standard for above or below. So, and that's going to be something that comes up a little bit later in a quote from Valens that we need to kind of pick apart. This position of the sun, whether it's above or below, is how we distinguish whether the chart is with light or without. It's this symbolism of day or night is determined by that horizon. The signs are different. They allow us to measure west to east effects of secondary motion. As a result, they build these relationships of good, harmonious dynamic between, sister signs effectively that create reciprocal federations. And so they come down to us in images and in pictures. Now, with the sun, whether it's above or below the horizon determines whether there is light, but with the moon, what we're paying attention to is the ecliptical longitude. It's the ecliptical longitude that determines whether the moon is visible or not visible. It doesn't have this same principle of above the horizon or below. If it's below the horizon, then of course it's not visible. But if it's above, that does not mean that the moon is visible. That's an important distinction to make because it's part of the logic that got built into the creation of a lunar ascendant and why we're projecting lunar phase against the ascendant. Okay. But by the time of Valens, I don't know the history of this circle of Athla. I have found no other mention of this, no record. I've looked everywhere. I've looked at there's a divination plate, an Etruscan divination plate from a few hundred years after this that has some associations that are similar. I think the second segment of that 16 cut liver, if I'm remembering correctly, was warfare and not foreign travel, but it did have warfare. So there was a few things that like, there's some link. Um, but I'm not sure the origin of this, but because it seems to respond very clearly to the signs and to the exaltation rulers, but not necessarily to the sign rulers as we understand them today, my guess is that this is quite old. And Valens, by the time of Valens, this distinction between house and sign with respect to the part of fortune had already started to erode. And I think that's principally because Valens didn't appreciate the part of fortune as an ascendant. So, in the same way, like as a lunar ascendant, is picturing something else reflected through the zodiacal circle rather than through the primary circle. And I'll show you what I mean by that and through some of his passages in a bit. Valens writes that the eighth place from the ascendant possesses the same power in relation to the causes of death, and similarly, the eighth place from the lot of fortune. So, in this older system that Manilius is reporting, the eighth lot, which would have been 8 times 30 degrees away from um, 150 degrees away from the part of fortune, that would be where the eighth lot is. And it would have been associated with class, social rank, and repute. But with Valens, he's just saying 8 means death. These are not distinct frames of reference any longer. So here's now where this is starting, what this has started to look like to me. This theme, I'm going to be drawing a couple of different branches about where people took different decisions. And this first line, I'm tempted to write like origin or the original system, but the truth is that this goes so far back. It would be really ridiculous of me to think that, um, that we've got a perfect picture of how this all started. But what we can say is that this line represents a tradition where the topic of reversing had not yet come up. Nobody had suggested that yet. That is what I'm putting forward, is that was somebody suggested that as an interpretation, and that represents a change. So on this line where no one's reversing until suddenly people start saying, well, we're still not reversing, but now we're being explicit that we're not, because it seems like some people have gotten confused. That's this first line. So back into the ancient past, this timeline, fortune emerges to provide the moon a dawning place like the sun has its own. And at some point, there is what I'm going to argue is a denaturing, that there's, for one reason or another, we're forgetting that fortune was tied to lunar phase and or that it's meant to be a lunar ascendant. We lose the justification for casting the light from the ascendant. Once you start reversing on this different timeline and you start a reversal process, we might now be casting from different points, or creating anti-ascendants or things like this. So, this represents a different understanding, that I believe is a denaturing of the original intent. Now, I don't think that that means, um, you know, that, well, what do I think that means when something gets denatured? It opens up, it's like grafting. It opens up a completely new opportunity for a sub-tradition to come into being that would not have been there before. But still, this is an important part of that process that makes that possible. It's like a genetic mutation. Something has to go wrong for a new thing to kind of start out. Is that like that old joke that evolution's greatest weapon has been the mistake, and what it's been able to do with that is impressive. So somewhere along this timeline, that's further back than, I've got line of sight into, at least with my limited language skill. Fortune, we lose the very obvious and tight association with Fortune as the lunar ascendant, and so we lose justification for casting it from the ascendant, lunar phase from the ascendant. Um, and I think the reason that this happens is because Greek codifiers struggled to make sense of a passage that comes out of Petasiris, which I'm going to show you the passage in question, or one of them anyway, in just a moment. It's around this period that Manilius, in the first decade AD, that Manilius writes his Astronomica. So he's following the reversal path. Somewhere before Manilius's writing, then there was the development of the Circle of Atla. I don't know how long it took for one lot to become 12. I've got no idea. But what we know is that by the time that Manilius is writing, there was a system of lots that were cast from fortune, and their nature was based on principles of secondary motion with an intention to take a lunar perspective. It's very clear. And it's drawing from triplicity considerations. It is drawing from the exaltation, the planets and exaltations within these signs. Then we have chart 81 that happens around this period. And then I think around that time, there's a further denaturing that leads us into the text of Dorotheus. Around this time, there ends up being a collapse of a distinction between the terrestrial houses and the circle of lots. So that's going to be right in the same ballpark as what Valens said about the eighth from the lot of fortune just means death, in the same way that the eighth house means death. And I think it was at this point that we started to see new lots get introduced. Now, somewhere, I think the whole reason that we have a lot of the sun, my argument is that part of fortune, the lot of the moon, and the lot of the sun were not created at the same time. That there was actually a significant amount of time between them. The lot of fortune, the sun already had an ascendant. The moon needed one. That's why the part of fortune was devised. And then from the creation of the part of fortune begins a tradition of a system of lots that is cast, and the different takes on that. There's a passage that caused people to question how it's calculated, which creates this mirroring effect. If we think back to chart 81 for a moment, and he makes the point that, the Scorpio's rising, the lot of fortunes in Sagittarius, only the ignorant would have put it in Libra. But now what ends up happening is, because there is this like opposite point now in our minds when we're calculating, is this a day chart or is it a night chart? I might need to reverse. And so there's two potential places. What that creates in the philosophy, in the natural philosophy that you would be, kind of contending with, is it creates a void. It creates a null space where something could have been but is not. And nature fills a void more reliably than, just about anything. So you create a lot of the moon because the moon needs an ascendant. We introduce this principle of reversing, and then suddenly it makes sense. Well, if the moon has a lot, why doesn't the sun? And if the moon and sun have a lot, why don't the other five planets also have lots? Now, what I don't know is, did all of this happen at the same time? Was the lot of the sun introduced at the same time as the five hermetic lots? Who can say? I haven't got no idea, but it certainly seems pretty clear that the lot of the sun was something that came. The only reason you could create a lot of the sun with this reversal is not realizing that this was supposed to be the answer to the ascendant. So you're creating a fractalized, kind of version of that solar imagery and doing this. And somewhere here, we start seeing the introduction of calculated lots with places from fortune now being found using themes of angularity and the effects of primary motion. So the eighth house signifies the beginning of death because that's the succeedent house that leads into the angle. It's the first point at which death becomes the thing that you're moving toward. The ninth house, you're falling from glory, but you're not yet moving toward death. That succeedent angle is where that kind of story changes. So that's a primary motion theme that's being, built in and used with the lots. So this is where I'm saying primary motion themes were not originally applied to the lots in the same way. And uh, that's the material that that Ptolemy's kind of writing about when he talks about all these numbers and all these lots for which there's no justification. Because if we don't understand, for instance, that the part of fortune is an extension of the lunar phase against the ascendant to give the moon an ascendant, then why are we adding and subtracting degrees between planets and casting them from the ascendant? Um, why are we adding and subtracting instead of multiplying? Why are we, there's just so many, it opens up a whole world of questions that is really not sufficiently answered. When I not recently, I suppose a few years ago, I got a copy of Dr. Ben Dyke's, his translation of Dorotheus's Carmen Astrologicum. And yeah, it's on my bookshelf. And um, yeah, it's a good text, and I was reading the introduction to it. There was this quote here that I want to bring out because I think it kind of illustrates that, maybe the answer's right in front of us. It says the two lots, he's talking about the book of and Dorotheus. There are two lots that are used with triplicity lords here, only two. The lot of fortune is so important that it makes sense to use it. So he's talking about in Dorotheus's text, when they talk about the lot of fortune, you're told to look at the triplicity ruler of where fortune falls. Okay, triplicity and fortune are very tightly wound. He says the lot of fortune, and only two lots do we see any reference like that. The lot of fortune, it makes sense. It's really important. But should all lots have that type of relationship, particularly the lot of spirit or the lot of the sun? It's another name for the lot of the sun. If so, why doesn't Carmen say so? And if not, why not? What is the difference between using a lot as a natural significator and a planet? Well, I mean, I should have thought the answer was kind of obvious that the reason that there's no mention of that with spirit or any of the other lots, I mean, there's one mention, I think it's a lot of marriage or something like that. There's one mention about a triplicity ruler relationship to a different lot that wasn't fortune. All the other relationships between triplicity rulers and a lot was connected to fortune. I think the answer is because it has a significantly longer history and tradition coming into Dorotheus's writing than the others. It's yeah, it doesn't really seem like too much of a mystery on that if we're open to the possibility that the lot of the sun and the Hermetic lots came out of successive misunderstandings of a passage in Petosiris. So to get to that passage, just quickly, I want to remind us what the calculation looks like. So according to the Ptolemaic explanation, lunar phase, 111 degrees. You cast that from the ascendant. There you have it. That is that's your part of fortune. And the ascendant and the sun will have the same relationship that the moon has to the part of fortune. So let's read this quote from Valens. He says, in the 13th book, after the blah, 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 the king attacks the lot of fortune from the sun and moon and the ascendant, which he mostly works with and makes mention of throughout the whole book, and which he judges to be a supreme place. So Valens is saying, well, in the work of Nechepso and Petosiris, we're seeing a lot of reference to the part of fortune. It seems really important. Concerning the lot of fortune, He has indeed presented the inversion and reversal as a riddle. And he writes, and the sun, being for all eternity from the morning, hands over the vault when it completes the circle in the evening, during which time it is visible. But when night is coming on, the moon does not always happen to be bringing light, but sometimes in the evening it is setting while being visible. Sometimes it remains visible up to some part of the night, and sometimes it makes its passages through the completion of night, wherefore it has entirely entrusted the circle to the sun. Now, if you are reading that passage and you don't know what Petasiris is saying, don't worry, you're in good company because Valens responded by saying different writers have said different things about this thought, but it seems to me that for a day chart, one should take the degrees from the sun to the moon in an equal amount from the ascendant. But if it's a night, so that everyone agrees with, there's nothing unusual there. And he says, however, for a night chart, as often as the moon is above the earth, if the moon is above the horizon, one should take from it to the sun and take that from the ascendant. But if the moon is not above the horizon, then you calculate from the sun to it. And you go back to the daytime formula. And then there's this footnote that says the problem with this is that nowhere in this book or in any of the others that were brought into this research has anyone actually used that. I think it's being overcomplicated by quite a lot. This passage explains why there is a very simple process of day chart, night chart. And it is the entire process has been entrusted to the circle of the sun, whether the sun is above the horizon or below, because it's consistent. The problem with the moon, if the moon is coming into combustion and then coming out of combustion, that can take a process of, 2, 3 days. So if you were waiting on the moon to be visible to call it a night chart, you would have 2 or 3 days where there were zero night charts. So part of what this passage from Petasiris is simply saying is that this whole idea of a day chart or a night chart is very simple. It's been entrusted to the sun because he's the consistent regulator. The moon is not. The moon cannot establish a pattern that's consistent that changes relatively evenly within a 24-hour period. It takes days for the moon to change, and then suddenly, it's just the dynamic of that is very different. I think that's what the passage is talking about. So the coming back to chart 81, where it makes his point about counting inversely, counting inversely, we might take, for instance, the distance from the sun to the moon and then cast that. We get it to Sagittarius. It's, just like 29 degrees separated. The ignorant would have taken it the other direction. So what does this inversely mean? Well, here's what I think that it means. This is another quote from Petasiris that's also in Valens, where I think it's really clearly stated that Petasiris did not speak irreverently about the sympathy of the sun and the moon in his book Factors or Definitions, whatever you want to call it. Whether you measure from the sun to the moon and take that distance from the ascendant, or from the moon to the sun and do likewise, you will find the lot located at the exact same point. This is a riddle because it's not a very effective translation of what he's saying. But I think all that Petasiris is saying is if you follow the standard protocol, and you measure 111 degrees and then you cast 111 degrees like we normally would, that gets you to 7 degrees Pisces, no problem. But you can also, if you want to measure the other direction, there's no problem with doing that. You could measure the distance on the other side. So if it's faster, see if the moon, and now if we count how many degrees from the moon to the sun, we get 251 degrees. But now to do this, you have to go against the order of the signs. And you just reverse the direction that you're going, but it'll take you to the same place. For a chart like that, it might not be very easy or simple to do, but for a chart like this, that might be really beneficial to take the shorter path and just make it easy on yourself instead of having to deal with big sums. So, I think the point that I really want to make here is that I think some very understandable, some real understandable confusion, trying to make sense of the work of previous astrologers. I mean, we're in the middle of doing this now. How many times have we looked at the Greek material, the Persian material, the Arabic material? I'm doing it now and thinking this is what they meant. And then in 5 decades, we've got a completely different understanding. It's totally understandable that Greek codifiers would have had a little bit of trouble making sense of what they were reading because we're talking about reversals, and whether you do it this way or that way with math is a little tricky and messy sometimes. Um, but I think it's a very simple principle, and I think it's worth remembering that the impact of a decision like this is pretty, it seems so small. Like I don't really use the part of fortune, to be honest with you, in the work that I do. But if I was going to work in length of life technique, it certainly does have an impact on what road makes sense to start evaluating, thinking about, how we would start to calculate such a thing. Um, but in addition to this, it helps to kind of illuminate a couple of different themes that we see in the work of Manilius or that we see elsewhere. As far as I know, no one's been able to make sense of that circle of Athla before. Like, why did those lots take the meanings that they took? Why did they take the meaning that they took? Why uh, is there discussion about signs there? Are they the same as houses? It doesn't seem like that's been too big of a discussion. So, my contribution to this, I think, is that hidden in that detail that's very confusing helps, I think, illuminate a little bit of an expectation about what the part of fortune was thought to be. And what its relationship was, where it was built. And, for me, I think it brings into question, what is the lot of spirit? It seems like every time, I mean, I talk about this often with horary, but when you use a derived house in horary, for instance, or in some other, the radical chart doesn't lose its meaning. Instead, what happens is that the turn chart takes a reduced meaning that then hopefully is still symbolic enough to kind of inform your reading of the radical chart, but the radical chart is the real primary focus. So the whole point is when you derive or when you take a starting point and then start to calculate off of it, you almost reduce the effectiveness by half. The part of fortune is a derivative lot system that is based off of the visible horizon and the visible planets and lunar phase, etc. So in my mind, a lot of fortune and all lots that are kind of derived through it are at least a 50% reduction in intensity and because it's a derivative. But then to then take that principle and then kind of fractal it back would now reduce the efficacy of, I think, the lot of spirit and the hermetic lots and all the other lots that came from this principle of we can add and subtract from different places. We're not trying to replicate phase. We're not trying to do this. We can just do whatever. Those would be I mean, would have to be at maximum like 25% efficacy, which is below where I like to spend my time. So, um, I guess that's, the kind of, idea that I'm looking to put out there for the moment is just questioning, um, where did this reversal process start? And then where does this show up throughout the historical material, in ways we might not have thought about?
Well, that was excellent, Wade. Do you want to open up
Yeah, let me
the
turn off
panel
my
there
screen and
review?
I'll get us into gallery view if that's okay.
Yeah, get into gallery view. Yeah, I have really, I can't speak for everybody else, but I have hung on to your every word. Uh, Fascinating, really, really important, beautifully presented material here. And I think, yeah, just really important. For me, there was so many details where I'm thinking, this makes sense of this, and this makes sense of this. And also, with the Manilius material, I'm constantly reminded of this. We don't like Manilius when he doesn't say what we
Yeah,
but
exactly.
there's so many
Yeah.
techniques in Manilius, and he's the oldest source. He's drawn from Babylonian sources. But the other thing is like he's the fusion. because by the time that he's writing in Rome, Rome has adopted the Egyptian, the demotic, symbolism. It's fully embraced astrology, and I can't help thinking that, like, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on this, but for example, I'm struck by the fact that in Babylonian astrology, there's no semblance of a lot system at all. There's
Right.
no reference to the part of fortune or any notion. I mean, it's just like planets and stars and aspects, but just not in the Babylonian tradition at all. But correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that our early sources that speak of this are Manilius, Valens, and Ptolemy.
That's
We've
right.
got the chart of 81, which is one of the oldest examples of it's actually being used.
Yeah.
With him saying, like, if you calculated it using reversing it, you would get in Libra, and that's what the ignorant would do.
Yeah.
But Valens is talking about, he's he's reading the text from Ptolemy. He's using Egyptian sources. For
Yeah.
me, the mystery of this does go back to Egypt, and we need more access to their ancient material. But even Valens couldn't understand it or couldn't
No,
find
exactly.
it.
Exactly. Well, and what I kind of think when the reason it feels Egyptian to me is because it all maps perfectly if it's set up against Cancer with the backdrop. So that has a decidedly Egyptian kind of tone
And
to it.
more when, like Manilius, I remember when I was first writing about Manilius, the scholarly view was, well, Manilius has got it wrong because he's got the joys wrong. But then you see more of the evidence of the material coming through from the demotic sources and Egyptian sources. And yes, Venus is absolutely, exalted in the 10th, Saturn should be in the 4th. So he's not wrong. He's just got this.
Representing something older.
To me, it seems clear that there, because there's nothing in the Babylonian tradition about any of the lots. If there's an origin, it's got to be from the Egyptian, but then it's like Greek astrology, and the time frame you've narrowed in on is when it all gets developed and comes to life. But as you say, like with Ptolemy, who's one of the clearest, as clear as anybody else, why would you say both by night and by day?
And start with night. And then also he was so dismissive of the others anyway, so just drop the others, that he's effectively saying, this is a bunch of superstition where it's not based on any natural cause.
And yeah, I mean, he uses the lot of fortune, doesn't he?
Yeah,
Because it's an essential thing for him. I think the rest of them is where he's kind of like, and I
exactly.
relate to that because I'll tell you what this means for me. For decades, when I did astrology, I used the part of fortune. And then I was told that we've got to reverse it, or I didn't reverse it because I thought, no, it's working for me as it is. I'm not reversing it. And then I felt so out of kilter with the rest, where the rest of the community has gone. I just stopped putting my part of fortune on the chart because I get people saying, why have you not turned it? And in the end, I more or less stopped using it because I just thought, like, for 2000 years, astrologers have been pretty consistent about this, and now it's all changed again, and I'm just so confused. Like, I'd rather not deal with it. So yeah, um, yeah. So my thoughts, but I don't know. Would anybody like to ask a question or put a view to Wade or even an argument? If
Yeah.
anybody would like to step up and say, I think that was just posh. Any hands going up? Any questions or points? Yes, Bill.
Hi, Wade, that was very interesting. And this is just a trivial thing, or relatively trivial thing compared to your subject matter, but the rationalizing the link between warfare and foreign travel,
Yeah.
the fact that that's a sort of an issue. It occurred to me, like, given that your man was writing whenever it was, 10 AD or something, what does foreign travel mean?
Yeah.
And who would be doing the foreign traveling? And they had an
Soldiers,
empire that
militaries, armies, exactly.
with their camps.
Yes.
So I think a lot of people who would be experiencing foreign travel in those days yeah, everybody else was working on the land,
Yeah,
would
you're totally
probably
right.
be.
Can I tell you where what they're part of the reason I got a little tripped up on that, just because if anybody goes into this research for themselves and go, don't trust me, go chase up what I'm talking about. So if you go back and read it, he talks about cancer and foreign trade. And so
Right.
I remember reading, well, if I'm trying to say this is bucked up against cancer, and why is foreign trade and foreign travel, but it's trade versus travel. It's a different kind of theme because
Yeah.
cancer was, yeah, this is when the Nile's flooding, you can move merchandise again, you can travel safely, there's supply, around. And the merchants who would go out to sea to sell their wares and come back wealthy, this is the origin of that cancers
Our
and trade
trade was
people.
sea, it
Yeah,
wasn't
yeah.
ancient, wasn't it? That
Ex-
point really connected with me when you showed the relationship to the triplicities, because from what I've seen already of Manilius, the triplicity symbolism infiltrates everything.
Yeah,
It's not overt. You've got to, like those of us that have been in the Manilius reading group, we've seen the triplicity arrangement peek into everything. So it doesn't make
everywhere,
any,
everywhere.
surprise at all that that is where you could see the relationships about that. But but going back to basically, so what, and I can see this immediately. This idea is you're reversing it to make the calculation, just
Mhm.
to make the calculation because it ends up in the same place.
Yeah,
I
yeah.
find that very convincing because how can you explain that remark away
How
otherwise?
could you? How could you? It's like it does feel to that passage feels to me like the smoking gun, the line, it doesn't matter because it'll be in the same place. That feels pretty tight.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
Does anybody else have any questions or thoughts to let's remove Wade's pin.
Charlotte, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm just thinking you were saying what Deborah was saying about no lots in the Babylonian astrology, and you saying it's probably just at the very dawn of uh, Greek astrology. I think you're probably right. I think at about the time when they got this concept horoscope or horoscopus that it would have sort of been an automatic thing to think, okay, we've got one for the sun, there should be one for the moon. That's my sense. They probably arose about the same time.
Well, you have to think also how important the moon was to magical rites in Egyptian spirituality, and the close association with the sun and the ascendant would naturally have created, why doesn't the moon have something like this? You know?
One other point on that, when you're saying that you think that the part of fortune is older, as do I. Following what you've said, but also instinctively, it just makes so much sense that the part of
Yeah,
fortune originated for a real reason, because knowing the relationship between the sun and the moon is so vital in all kinds of astronomy, and astronomy at that time was so vital in any kind of civil organization calendar. So you had to know the relationship and the phase between the sun and the moon, and that's what the part of fortune marks.
yeah,
That's also another reason why I started to disengage from it, because I was thinking, well, all it's doing really is it's telling us the relationship from the sun and the moon, and I can see it.
yeah.
So, like if you've got a new moon, you're always going to have the part of fortune on the ascendant. And I've seen too many horror astrologers that have said, oh, the part of fortune's on the ascendant, that's good. Well, no, because it's a old moon, there's no moon, it's actually bad. And so I'm kind of like, because what it is doing is it's simply, if the sun and moon are in opposition, part of fortune in the seventh house. So to me, it's like that's taking away from the big issue is the sun and moon in opposition, because that's what it's about.
Yeah.
So therefore, that would have been in astronomy as long as as astronomy, there would have been a recognition of a need for that relationship and something that marked it. The
Yeah.
rest of them, I think, grew up as a system and scheme around it at the time when
Yes.
many schemes were
We're
developed.
being, and which is, it's still happening today. New schemes, new ideas are getting, kind of thought up every day. And great, let them stand on their own merits. It's not an issue, just trying to say what a thing is. I remember there's a passage in Ibn Ezra. I didn't include it in this presentation, but maybe I ought to have. also related to this length of life technique where Ibn Ezra is talking about directions to part of fortune and how the ascendant and the part of fortune, while they function very similarly, they respond differently to different planets because the ascendant is hot like the sun and the part of fortune is cold like the moon. And so what they find destructive is not the same. And so there's also, Ibn Ezra was making the point that you have to understand that the part of fortune is a lunar ascendant to understand why certain transits are listed as negative that wouldn't maybe not seem negative, or the other way around.
Oh, right. Anybody got any other remaining questions or thoughts for Wade before we let him go? Yeah, it's been, I'll just read you, beautiful presentation, truly outstanding. Lisa's going to listen to it a few more times. I might even listen to it again, Wade. Masterful. Yeah, I think that this is something that probably, needs a bit more thought, but it sounds to me like it's very important what you've done. And yeah, well done, Wade. This is
Well, thanks for giving me some space to present it. I appreciate it. Lisa, I see your hand is up. It looks like we're about to wind down. So if you have a question, jump
yeah,
on.
let Lisa make her point.
Yeah.
No, I'd just like to say thank you very much. I was glued. I have to go back and listen again and pause and think some things out, but thank you so much. That's all.
Thank you. I had to deliver it 4 times to figure out how to talk about it. So it's equal. All right. Thank you so much. Thanks again, Deb. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, it's wonderful to have you. And I can't remember who's coming up next time, but I will float the details when we circulate the recording for this tomorrow. So yeah. Thank you, everybody, and good night. And thanks again, Wade.
Bye.
Really
Bye,
enjoyed it.
everybody.
Thanks.
Bye.